Have you ever grappled with the intricate layers of love? I have. My journey took an unexpected turn when my world came crashing down with a heart-wrenching confession. My wife, Katie, the woman I pledged my heart to, dropped a bombshell. I love you, Tom, but I realize I still love Greg too. Suddenly, the secure world I knew was shattered, revealing a hidden affair with Greg, her high school sweetheart, who had recently re-entered our lives. This is my story, a tale of confronting the shadows of past loves and the quest for closure. Did you know that the average high school romance lasts around 3 weeks? Katie and Greg defied that statistic for a full 40 years. They first met when Katie was a freshman and Greg was a sophomore, and they became inseparable from that point on. Theirs was a true, almost mythological love that seemed to stand the test of time and remained pure. Interestingly, Kat and I were married for around 30 of those years. At the time, I believed our bliss was genuine. Our marriage was satisfying, and the arrival of our daughter Joan only strengthened our love. I was content during those years, truly content. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Marsh, and Katie has been my loyal wife for almost 3 decades. As mentioned earlier, Kat and Greg were high school sweethearts, and yes, she did lose her purity to him. Most high school romances end eventually, but Greg was a year ahead of Katie in school, so their separation seemed temporary. He planned to earn a fortune after graduation so that he could marry her. This was a story my wife frequently told during our marriage. After high school, Greg took a pipeline job in Alaska with his uncle, which marked the beginning of their troubles. Greg seemed to stop communicating shortly after his arrival, leaving Kat alone throughout her final year. She considered dating someone named Sam or Simpson, but her heart remained fixed on Greg. Despite Kat's patient waiting, Greg remained silent and uncommunicative. Greg apparently found fulfillment in pipeline work and chose a nomadic existence. Convinced that his beloved Katie was still waiting for him to become wealthy and sweep her off her feet upon his return, reality revealed a different picture. Life moved on, and nothing remained still. This was true for Katie, who went to college, graduated, and met me at a party when she was 24. Despite the fact that I was 29 years old, we were a good fit. I instantly fell for her, and I believe she felt the same way about me. Our marriage was ordinary, with the exception of one small hitch. 2 days before our wedding, Greg sent a letter to Katie, the prodigal son returning home, urging her to meet him. Thankfully, Kat's mother intervened, telling her to focus on her new life and not waste time with Greg, whom she referred to as that junk. After some emotionally charged moments where I feared Kat might cancel the wedding, she went ahead with it, becoming my wife, Mrs. Katie Marsh. We were already on our honeymoon when Greg showed up, having evidently enlisted in the Marines out of desperation. After our honeymoon, we settled into our new routines, with Kat working as a nurse and me as an insurance adjuster for a major corporation. While my marriage remained strong, there was one recurring concern. Greg began texting Katie, and she reacted willingly. When I questioned the necessity of this, she grew defensive, claiming he was merely an old acquaintance in need of help. Being unmarried and in the Marines, she was simply writing to brighten his spirits. I can't claim ignorance because I was aware of his continuous correspondence with her and her return letters. Despite my and her family's best efforts, she persevered until news arrived that he had married someone at his station, effectively ending their communication and restoring my peace of mind. Over the next 3 years, she received only 3 Christmas cards from Greg. During this lull in communication with Greg, our daughter Joan was born, and we worked tirelessly to construct a home and provide Joan with a comfortable life. Those were good days, and we worked well together to nurture and grow our child. However, as often happens, a disruption occurred. Katie received a letter from Greg, but never discussed it. I noticed our stamp consumption increasing, leading me to believe she had restarted correspondence with him. Despite this, I chose to ignore it, thinking it was his responsibility to safeguard democracy while I ensured my family's safety. If they chose to write to one another, I considered it their business, regardless of my feelings. Kat eventually began discussing with me some information she had gleaned from Greg. He divorced his first wife and remarried. He had seen war and was presumably well decorated. Katie spoke with pride about her former Marine, and I paid only partial attention. I gently corrected her, reminding her that he preferred to be called a Marine, not a soldier. Katie chuckled softly and said she should be more careful. Her discussions about him saddened me, but I hoped that one day she'd move on and focus on our family. Unfortunately, that day never came. Greg had been in the Marines for 30 years, gone through 3 marriages and divorces, and earned enough decorations to rival General Patton. I realized with disappointment that, although Greg had become more appealing to my wife over the years, I had merely gotten older and more predictable. My only relief was the notion that Greg would settle far away from us after his release. Unfortunately, this was not the case. And here we are now. Our daughter Joan has grown up and married a great man named Frank Campbell. Even better news, they're expecting their first child. At 60 years old, I was looking forward to reaching 65, when I could retire and spend the rest of my life in peace and tranquility. Katie is still as beautiful as ever and has the ability to make my heart skip a beat. Little did I know that the tranquility in my life would soon be destroyed. One Thursday, when I returned home, I found Kat dressed impeccably, telling me about a dinner reservation at 7 p.m. Initially perplexed, I scanned my memory for any forgotten anniversary or birthday, only to realize that this wasn't the case. So I went along with it, freshened up, and tried to match Kat's elegance. Dinner was wonderful, and the restaurant was packed, so I suspected Kat had more on her mind than just a meal. As we finished our dinner, I turned to her and said, "Okay, now you can tell me. I'm in a good mood and won't make a scene." One of my characteristics is that I never lose my cool in public. Working in the insurance industry teaches you to maintain your composure in public, and that habit has carried over into my personal life. Kat knew this about me and would choose a public place to deliver potentially upsetting news. Tonight, looking at her expression, I could tell something was wrong. After 30 years together, you learn to read your partner. Tonight, I was paranoid that something would go wrong and ruin my evening. Finally, with trepidation, she announced the news. "Tom, I think you should know that Greg has returned." I felt nauseated, but I knew it wasn't from the food. I stared at her, eager for more information, but Kat just looked at me carefully. Finally, I broke the uneasy silence. "When you say he's returned, do you mean from a vacation?" She shook her head and whispered softly, "No, Tom, he isn't on vacation. He was discharged from the service and bought a home 2 streets away from us." With that, my anxiety level spiked, and I quickly interrupted, "And he'll be living there with what? His 3rd wife?" Again, she spoke quietly. "No, he divorced again, but this time he had to forfeit a portion of his pension because of her." I tried to control my rage, but I couldn't stop muttering nonsense. It's just too much. Some nearby diners looked at me with surprise. My frustration wasn't because Greg had lost a portion of his pension to his ex, but because he had moved closer to us, and I needed to understand why. I grew more forceful. "Katie, you haven't met Greg, have you?" Her expression answered my question before she even replied. "When and how did this happen, Katie?" She responded with a slightly downcast expression. "He stopped by our house yesterday to let me know that we're officially neighbors." My heart was pounding, and I continued the interrogation, afraid of what I might discover. "Did you sleep with him, Kat?" Her expression said it all before she confessed. "I did, Tom, but it's not what you think." I almost roared as I looked into her eyes. "Kat, I believe my loyal wife slept with someone other than her husband. Now, explain to me how this isn't what I think it is." "I did it because Tom needed me," she said. "When he approached me, he seemed lost. He's dealing with anxiety or something related to his divorce, and he really needed me, so I tried to help him. I love you, Tom, but I've realized I still love Greg." So there it was. My wife had slept with Greg, and he used his PTSD and divorce as excuses to worm his way back into Kat's heart and bed. I looked her in the eye and spoke with a strength I had seldom shown during our marriage. "Okay, Kat, the damage is done. We can get through this and take back our lives, but you cannot sleep with him again. Do you understand?" She looked at me, sobbing, and spoke calmly but firmly. "Tom, I can't promise that. I love him, and he needs me more than you." It was crushing to hear those words from her, yet a public restaurant was hardly the appropriate setting for our private conflict. I asked the waiter for the bill. 10 minutes later, we were driving home, and I brought up the topic again. Kat, how can you be with him when you already have a husband? Have you forgotten the vows we made over 30 years ago? Remember to forsake all others. She started crying openly, confessing between sobs. I'm sorry, Tom, but he needs me. We've found each other again. I can't bear the thought of losing him or you. I didn't know what to say or do to get her to let him go. With a hint of annoyance in my voice, I shouted, So what then? Should we take turns having days off? He gets you for New Year's, while I get you for Christmas? Stop it, Kat. You cannot have two men. She stopped crying and gave me a strange look. What about a break, Tom? Now it was my turn to be taken aback. What do you mean, Kat? She changed the subject. Tom, do you remember about 18 years ago when you took a year off to pursue your master's degree? You did what you had to do and then came back to work, and everything was fine. I shook my head irritably. Kat, how can you compare me earning a degree that benefited our family and the company to your involvement with this man, which only benefits the two of you at this point? I pulled into the driveway and shut off the engine. Kat reached out and caressed my face, making a passionate plea. Tom, I missed my last year of high school with Greg, and if I had, we might not be in this situation tonight. Give me this year, and we'll be rid of Greg, and I promise to be the best wife to you. I need this time, Tom, please. I felt a mix of sadness, hurt, shock, and depression. The urge to strangle Katie and squeeze until her eyes dimmed surged within me. But I remembered stories about incarceration and how some husbands lost their freedom and possessions in bouts of rage. I said, All right, Kat, if this is truly what you want, feel free to proceed, but let me be clear. I do not want to see or hear from you in any manner for the entire year. Understand? Also, keep in mind that in a year, you may not have anyone to return to. I hoped that the tight limitations I imposed on her break would dampen her enthusiasm, but it seemed futile. She seemed oblivious to my words after agreeing and kissing my cheek. She thanked me and promised I wouldn't regret it. I shook my head, indicating that it was too late and that I already regretted it. That night, she craved intimacy, but I chose to ignore her. The thought of her with Greg made me sick, and I couldn't bear physical contact as we prepared for bed. I grabbed a pillow and told her I'd sleep in the guest room. I noticed it hurt her deeply, and part of me was relieved, hoping she might reconsider her plans. The next morning, I woke up hoping that the previous night had been an anomaly and that Kat would change her mind in the light of day. I was wrong. When I entered the kitchen, she was preparing breakfast, looking as if she had just won the lottery. She smiled at me and pointed to the calendar hanging on our wall. I couldn't help but notice how today's date, June 6th, was surrounded by a thick black line. I sat at the table, contemplating the irony of the date. In 1944, hundreds of soldiers and sailors fought to free Europe from tyranny. But today, I lost my wife to another oppressor. Katie was almost ecstatic as she served me breakfast and placed it in front of me. She responded, I understand your concerns, my love, but a year from today, I'll be completely yours. I really need this time to figure things out and clear my mind. I promise you won't be disappointed. She smiled blissfully at me before continuing. I called Greg this morning while you were still sleeping and told him about your agreement to give me this break. He'll be here to pick me up in an hour. Every word she spoke made my heart sink, but I felt compelled to give her one last chance. Kat, you don't have to go through with this. I'm urging you to reconsider. You can't guarantee that in a year you'll be free of him. Focus on freeing yourself from his grip and trying to heal our marriage. Please don't risk destroying what we have. She spoke softly, smiling at me with a sense of superiority. Tom, I appreciate your love in giving me this time. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. Our marriage will be even stronger when I return. Now, honey, I need to finish packing, so eat your breakfast. With that, she left the kitchen, effectively ending our marriage. Despite the terrible meal, I finished it and went to get dressed. As I entered our bedroom, I noticed Kat's 3 enormous suitcases, each packed with her possessions. She smiled at me tenderly and said, I think I have everything I need. Please bring these bags to the porch for Greg. I looked at her blankly before responding, No. Her expression changed to astonishment when I refused. I continued my harsh response by adding, "Listen, if you're determined to end a 30-year marriage, you and that fool can carry your bags together. I will not support you in this ridiculous endeavor. Is that clear?" Kat, on the edge of tears, retorted angrily, "He's not a fool. Greg is a good man and a hero who has served his country. He's accomplished more than you ever have." I turned away, muttering, "Yes, he received medals while I worked 5 days a week to provide for you and our daughter. You may be right, but it means nothing to me." Katie carried all of her belongings down the stairs to the driveway, giving me contemptuous looks with each suitcase she grabbed. Soon after, a car arrived at our house, and a man, whom I assumed was Greg, began loading her items from our porch. Katie called out to him, saying she'd be right there, before returning to say goodbye. We stood awkwardly facing each other, and I broke the silence. "First, if you actually intend to go through with this foolish scheme, remember the terms. I do not want any communication for the entire year." I could tell it was sinking in for her as she sheepishly said, "I understand, Tom, but everything will work out. You'll see. Remember, you promised to give me this year." She waited for my reaction, but I remained silent. Finally, with a more puzzled expression, she slowly stated, "I really love you." She went in for a kiss, but I turned away just in time, so she settled for a touch on my cheek. I quickly stated, "I can't kiss you knowing you're going to him." She rushed out of the house, tears streaming down her face and into his arms, standing at the door. As I watched her passionately embrace him, a wave of hatred surged within me. 2 minutes later, my driveway was empty, matching the emptiness in my heart as I realized my wife had become another man's partner. I called in sick from work that morning and went straight to the hardware store to buy new locks. I spent the entire morning changing the locks on the house and updating the security codes on the alarm system. Fortunately, it kept me busy and took my mind off Katie. However, as I finished, the melancholy returned, washing over me like a wave on the shore. Then I did what most people would do in this situation. I turned off our home phone and started drinking heavily. Despite the intent to dull the pain of Katie's departure, it proved ineffective. My battle with excessive drinking lasted until Sunday morning when I ran out of alcohol, a blessing since I was physically, spiritually, and emotionally drained. I finally went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by a knock at the door. Groggy, I wandered around, trying to find the source, who turned out to be my daughter Joan tapping on the front door. When I let her in, she was taken aback by my disheveled state and the strong odor of alcohol lingering in the house. Her first words were, "What's going on, Dad?" I struggled to focus amid the pounding in my head, but I managed to respond, "What do you mean?" She looked at me with a bewildered expression before leading me to the kitchen. "You need coffee and food, Dad. Then you can explain what's happened." An hour later, with food in my stomach and coffee in hand, I told her what I knew about her mother and Greg. To say she was stunned is an understatement. "Dad, let me get this straight. Mom is planning to take a year off from our marriage to rekindle things with her old high school boyfriend?" I nodded in agreement, saying yes or something along those lines. Her subsequent questions echoed those I'd been wrestling with since Friday. "What's your plan, Dad?" I met her eyes, and the words seemed to spill from my lips. "Tomorrow, I'll call in sick again and see a lawyer." Joan appeared disappointed and speculated, "I can't believe Mom would do this. Maybe it's some kind of midlife crisis." I replied with a blank expression, "I really don't know, Joni." She looked at me with a melancholy I hadn't seen before. "I'm at a loss, Dad. I'd like to advise you to reconsider, but this seems like your best option." Joan stayed with me for a few more hours, even making dinner for later. As she left, she kissed me goodbye and apologized. Before she left, I asked, "Why did you come here today?" She gazed into my eyes. "Mom called and asked me to check on you, but she didn't say why or where she was." I nodded, pretending to understand. "All right, thank you, and drive safely, sweetie." Monday morning, I woke up feeling terrible and also had an appointment with a lawyer. My instincts about Katie were correct, and even though the divorce proceedings seemed to favor me, her resistance prevented her from claiming half of my pension. Other joint assets remained unsettled. I was confident that taking a break from Katie would provide an opportunity to settle those assets. The 3 weeks that followed flew by, and I was amazed at how quickly I adjusted to being alone. On the plus side, I felt a burden lifted. I was no longer responsible for someone else. The downside was waking up and going to bed alone. I didn't hear from Katie until mid-July. One Saturday, I went to Flynn's, a classy restaurant in our city, and sat at the bar as they arrived, holding hands like smitten teenagers. Their attraction to each other was obvious. Greg's strong and reasonably good looks caught my attention, though he was oblivious to my presence. I could see why Katie was drawn to him. He seemed to have a hold on her, and she followed his lead willingly. He spoke, and she listened intently. When she stood to go to the restroom, she spotted me at the bar and offered a cautious smile. When she returned, she approached me hesitantly. "Hello, Tom. How are you?" Despite my urge to ignore her, I maintained decorum and replied, "Oh, as good as one can be when your 30-year marriage crumbles because your wife abandons you for some fool." My scathing remark confused her, but she remained composed. "Tom, I need to get into our house. I left some personal items there, but my key didn't work when I tried to enter the other day." I smiled and responded politely, "Well, Katie, it shouldn't come as a surprise that your key no longer works in my house." She stood there, bewildered, before I spoke again. "I think you should get back to your companion before he gets worried." Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned and walked away, and I returned to the more important task of finishing my drink. 2 minutes later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder and was turned around in my chair to face an irritated Greg. "Hey, jerk, you made my girlfriend cry, and I don't appreciate that." I felt like he was about to hit me, and my pulse quickened as I realized he could overpower me before anyone could intervene. With more conviction than I felt, I went on the offensive. "You're referring to my wife, not your girlfriend. And now that you've stolen her, you have no say in our business. Hit me if you want, but think about the consequences with the police." I could see the wheels turning in his head, knowing Greg wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but it only encouraged me to continue my verbal assault. "Now you have two choices. 1, hit me and end up in jail, or 2, get out of my sight and sit yourself down." My heart raced, and a part of me screamed, "Why resist?" But as Greg weighed his options, I kept up a brave face. Fortunately, the manager stepped in and asked what the problem was. Greg scowled at him before grumbling that there was no problem and slowly retreated toward Katie. 5 minutes later, they paid the bill and left. Driving home that evening, I wondered what personal belongings Katie wanted from the house and decided to find out. I spent nearly 3 hours searching fruitlessly before discovering boxes beneath her dresser. Beneath them were letters from Greg to Katie. As I read them, it became clear that the affair with Greg had been planned for years. One letter, dated 5 years ago, read, "It's comforting to know that you still miss me. When I return, we will be together. You'll need to find a way to get rid of your weak husband." Reading them all felt like flipping through a cheap novel. Many of the letters detailed his plans for Katie or reminisced about their high school days. By the end, Katie's life seemed significantly less complicated without me. I didn't hear from Katie until September 1st, my birthday. I returned home from work that day to find a covered dish and a birthday card on the porch. When I took them inside, I realized Katie had made my favorite stew. The card wished me a happy birthday and included a note that read, "Tom, I know we're not supposed to communicate, but I couldn't ignore your birthday. Every night, I dream about us, and I know that by the end of the year, I will be yours and he'll be gone. Please don't stop loving me or abandon us. Love, Katie." My daughter Joan had been keeping a close eye on me since Katie's departure, and she called me on my birthday. After some small talk, she revealed the real reason for the call. "Dad, you know I'm due in 3 weeks, right? How could I forget the birth of my first grandchild?" "Yes, I know, honey. You and Frank must be excited." When she continued, a slight hesitation made me aware of a potential issue. "Dad, Frank and I had dinner with Mom and Greg. Mom wants to be there when the baby is born, and she wants Greg to come with her. I know you and Mom promised no communication for a year, but could you please make an exception for me just this once?" The fact that Joan and her husband had dinner with them shocked me, but I wouldn't ruin the birth of her first child. "Okay, Joan, she can come and get him if she must." Joan quickly corrected me. Dad, please stop calling him names. He's not that bad, and he makes Mom happy. I haven't seen her this happy in years. I was stunned. Then anger surged through me as I retorted, Years ago, your grandmother called him names. Nothing has changed. First, you're all having dinner together. Now you're defending him. I'm not sure what he's up to, but he's slowly tearing my family away from me. Just out of curiosity, when will you start calling him Dad? She spoke hastily, with sadness in her voice. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean it that way. I can imagine how you feel, and I'm truly sorry. I cut her apology short, speaking sharply. It's okay. Forget about it. Listen, I've got something in the oven that I need to attend to. Take care. She said she loved me before hanging up. It was around this time that I realized my life would never be the same again, and that I needed to take a stand. First, I began liquidating my assets to reduce my net worth. Second, I overcame my hesitation and re-entered the dating world. The next few days were busy. First, I sought legal advice on asset management from my lawyer. Then I purchased self-defense insurance in the form of a stun gun, ready for any confrontation with Greg. Third, I planned a trip to Vegas in October. And fourth, I explored companionship online, hoping to meet a woman my age looking for a stable, long-term relationship. Since my wife no longer lived with me, I was free to use or give away my possessions as I saw fit. The situation intrigued me because of the incredible flexibility it offered in shaping my future plans. During Joan's labor, I was at work and my secretary answered the phone. Her husband, Frank, was overjoyed to tell me that I had become a grandfather. I rushed to the hospital after extending my congratulations. When I arrived, I went straight to Joan's room. Approaching the door, I overheard her conversation with Katie. Mom, what you and Dad are doing seems completely senseless. Do you really want to lose him to Greg? Katie's voice was soothing. Don't worry, Joan, I won't lose your father. His love for me is so deep that he'll never leave. Besides, what I'm sharing with Greg now is amazing. It's hard to explain, but every day feels like high school. It's just better now that we can be physically together. He treats me like a princess and sweeps me off my feet every night. I've never felt such closeness in my life. I'll really miss this when I go back to your father. Joan's voice was filled with scorn. Mom, I don't want to hear about your bedroom routine with Greg. I acknowledge that he's a great man and you two seem like a perfect match. But I want my child's grandparents to be together, not separated or arguing. Please, Mom, go back to Dad before it's too late. He may be dull and predictable, and certainly not in the same league as Greg, but Dad will always be there for you. Greg is undeniably attractive, but all good things must come to an end. On the other hand, Dad is a constant. He won't leave you if you do everything right. If necessary, beg him on your knees, but convince him to take you back. After a brief silence, Joan pleaded, Mom, don't wait too long or you may lose him. Katie's voice betrayed her misguided hope. You don't have to worry about your father and me. When I'm done with Greg, he'll welcome me back with open arms. Joan's voice was full of doubt. I know you think you understand, Dad, but I've seen and talked to him, and he's changing, and not for the better, it seems. He's been bitter and distant since you left. Are you really willing to risk our 30-year marriage for your high school sweetheart? Having heard enough, I took the opportunity to enter the room, exclaiming with a forced smile, Hello, Mom. Congratulations on your new baby. You two must be thrilled. I stepped up and hugged Joan, ignoring Katie. It was childish of me, but it felt easier at the time. Katie gave me a dirty look, but Joan brightened as she asked, Have you seen him yet, Dad? I shook my head. No, honey. I just came to check on you. Katie eventually interjected in an unfriendly tone after growing tired of the cold shoulder. Hello, Tom. How are you? I gazed at her for a moment before returning my attention to Joan, inquiring about the birth and the baby's name. Joan's face lit up, and she exclaimed joyfully, Frank and I agreed. We're going to name our son Thomas after you, Dad. Katie excused herself, saying she was going to see the baby. After she left, I took Joan's hands and spoke in a serious tone. Joan, you should know that your mother and I are unlikely to reconcile. I could see how deeply my words affected her. No, Dad, I don't believe that. She'll come to her senses soon and come back home. My eyes filled with tears as I continued. Baby, I've realized I was never enough for your mother. Something's gonna happen soon." Her expression was one of shock and disbelief. "What?" I smiled sadly. "I'm going to start divorce proceedings soon after I've sorted out a few things." She spoke with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Dad, I told Mom she should beg you to take her back, but is it too late now?" I nodded in agreement. "Yes, I won't be able to reconcile with her. The memories of her betrayal would be too overwhelming for me. Please don't say anything to her just yet, okay?" She nodded before pulling me in for a hug. We talked for a few more minutes about various topics, carefully avoiding any mention of my wife or her lover. Finally, I promised to visit the next day and let her enjoy the baby's journey to the children's ward. I found my grandson among many other newborns and was amazed by how tiny and delicate he looked. Realizing the beauty of the moment, Frank approached me with a smile, standing between Katie, Greg, and me. He handed me a cigar. "Here, Dad, smoke in celebration." I placed the cigar in my pocket and patted Frank on the back. "I'll save it for later, son. Thank you." I felt nauseated as I watched my wife and her lover hold hands like teenagers. "Listen, Frank, I'll come back tomorrow when the air is less, thick, if you catch my drift." Frank smiled knowingly. "I completely understand, Dad, and I don't blame you one bit." As I prepared to leave, Katie timidly called out to me, "Tom, it feels like just yesterday we were bringing our baby home, and now it's unbelievable that she has one of her own. Time flies, but too quickly." I stared at her, still holding Greg's hand, and walked out of the room without saying a word. She seemed confused as I left them standing there. October arrived, and it turned out to be my best month since Katie left. I went to Vegas with the intention of gambling and losing, using it as an excuse to deplete our joint assets. However, what made the trip truly enjoyable was the woman I met there. Miranda, a woman in her 50s, surprised me with her vibrant personality, claiming that many men like older women, and in my case, she was right. Miranda was expensive, but she made me feel more alive than I had in years. For the first time since Katie left, I didn't miss her at all. Miranda was skilled both in and out of bed, and she showed a genuine interest in me by asking about my soon-to-be ex-wife and her new partner. By the end of the night, Miranda knew more about me than I did. Moved by my story, she tenderly caressed my face before leaving. "Tom, I've only known you for a few hours, but I feel compelled to tell you something. You're a good man, and that's a rare find, believe me. As someone who's seen and been with thousands of men, I can count on one hand the ones I truly liked and respected. You're one of them. Your wife has no idea what she's letting go of, but don't let her actions and foolishness change who you are. And if you ever find yourself back in town, give me a call, because I'd love to see you again." Miranda and my Vegas trip left me more confused than when I first arrived. Reflecting on Miranda's words, I realized she was right. Despite Katie's 3 decades of being a devoted wife and mother before her betrayal, I was set on seeking revenge. No, I refused to let this marriage leave me broken. Upon my return from Vegas, I instructed my lawyer to begin drafting divorce papers. Additionally, I resolved to gather more information about Greg Hollander. Acting on my lawyer's recommendation, I hired a firm to delve into his background, from high school to the present. Despite the firm's hefty fees, I didn't hesitate, knowing half the expenses would be covered by Katie's share. Confident in the firm's thoroughness, I was sure they'd provide all the necessary information before Christmas. I also broached the topic of transferring to a branch office of our company with my boss, who was initially surprised considering my previous reluctance to relocate. My boss promised to look into it and let me know. Thanksgiving loomed as the next hurdle I had to face. Joan called me about a week before the holiday to invite me to dinner with them. When I inquired about her mother and her companion's attendance, she hesitantly confirmed they would be there. Upon hearing this, I firmly declined and ended the call. Surprisingly, my son-in-law Frank reached out to me. Frank called my office and requested a meeting. We agreed on a time and met at a quiet bar in the city center for a drink. That evening, I noticed Frank was agitated. After exchanging initial pleasantries, I ordered 2 double scotches, sensing something was bothering my son-in-law. I sat back and listened as Frank confided in me about what was happening with my wife and daughter. "Dad, you won't believe it. but they're both infatuated with him. It's all Greg this and Greg that. You'd think he was the guy from the beer commercial, the most interesting man in the world. Frank's frankness surprised me, and I began to wonder why he had come to persuade me to attend Thanksgiving. I needed to understand, so I asked, "Do I understand correctly, Frank, that you don't approve of dear Mr. Hollander?" Frank looked at me with evident anger. "Dad, this man is arrogant, self-centered, selfish, and worse. He's so in love with himself that I can't fathom where he has any room left for Katie." Realizing his outburst, his expression shifted to one of remorse, and he quickly retreated. "Sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to disrespect her." I reassured him with a smile. "No worries, son. Don't be offended. When did you start calling her Katie instead of Mom? You seemed devastated when she left you. Since then, I've lost all respect for her." Now I was curious. Why did her departure affect you, if I may ask? His face flushed with anger once more. "I'm sure you noticed during the time I was with Joan that I never discussed my parents with you guys, and I appreciate that you never asked about them. The truth is, my mother cheated on my father. After that, they split and my father never recovered. He drank himself into oblivion, and my mother died in a car accident with her lover. I despise cheaters, and now that Katie has become one, I can't stand her anymore. I'm pretending for Joan's sake, but I'm worried." I had never heard about Frank's parents before and empathized with his pain. Yet I was also intrigued by his apprehension. "Frank, you mentioned being worried. What's on your mind, son?" He took a deep sip from his glass, ordered another, then turned to me. "I might upset you with this, but you asked. The saying like mother like daughter worries me. If Katie has turned into a cheater and keeps praising it to my wife, how long before Joan gets tempted to stray too?" My eyebrows lifted at his concern. "I see where you're coming from." I joined him in taking a contemplative sip of my drink, pondering my next steps. "Listen, Frank, don't lose hope. I have some surprises up my sleeve, and I think things might start to change in the new year. Also, strictly between us, I've got plans to make it a good Christmas for you and Joan, but not so much for the others if you catch my drift." Frank's smile emerged for the first time since we sat down, and he spent the next 15 minutes trying to pry information from me, to no avail. As we wrapped up our meeting, I smiled again. "Aren't you forgetting something, Frank?" He looked puzzled. "What, Dad?" I put a hand on his shoulder. "Shouldn't you try to persuade me to be a big boy and attend Thanksgiving?" Frank's smile widened. "Oops. Okay. Will you come to Thanksgiving, Dad?" I shook my head in response. "No, but I appreciate the invite." Joan called me twice more before Thanksgiving, pleading for my attendance until I finally put my foot down. "Look, Joan, when your mother left me back in June, I made it clear there'd be no contact for a year. She wanted to end our marriage. I've already broken that rule once for little Thomas's birth, but I won't break bread with them. Is that understood?" The holiday arrived, and I had a frozen dinner. I felt lonely and sad, but it beat watching Katie and Greg exchange looks. December arrived, bringing with it the looming prospect of another family holiday. I dreaded it, but I knew it'd be the last one I'd have to endure. December turned out to be eventful. Firstly, the company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, and I accepted. Secondly, the private investigator's report on Mr. Hollander came through, and it was revealing. Apparently, old Greg had a history of infidelity, with 3 ex-wives divorcing him for cheating. He also had children with women other than his wives, for whom he paid child support. Furthermore, his last wife received half his pension in the divorce, and he was demoted from an E8 to an E6 in his final year in the Corps. In short, his financial and moral standing appeared rather dubious, if not downright dismal. The latest positive development is that Katie will receive her divorce papers on the first business day after Christmas. Now the holiday spirit was coursing through me. I phoned Joan to discuss Christmas plans, and once again, she pleaded for a true family gathering. When I inquired about Greg's attendance, Joan became irate. "Dad, you need to accept it. He's part of our family now, whether you like it or not." I cut her off abruptly. "You're right. I don't like it, but for the child's sake, I'll be there." Joan seemed genuinely pleased as she exclaimed, "Thank you, Dad. This will make everyone so happy." I doubted that would be the case, but who was I to spoil the fun? 2 days later, upon returning home from work, the phone rang, and instinctively I answered, "Hello." The line remained awkwardly silent, and I almost hung up when a voice finally responded. "Tom, it's me. Katie, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" Her voice sounded hesitant. "No, I'm fine, Tom, but I wanted to thank you for agreeing to come for Christmas. I realize now how much I've hurt you. We've never spent a holiday apart in 30 years. I was miserable at Thanksgiving without you, and I've been thinking about us so much lately." I cut short her nostalgic trip. "Well, Katie, I'm glad to hear you reflect on us. However, I must remind you that when you initiated this separation, I insisted on no communication between us. I made an exception for Christmas Day, so I believe we should end this conversation now. Goodbye." After hanging up, I felt awful. I had never spoken to her so harshly in our entire 30-year marriage, but as guilty as I felt about my words, it didn't compare to the day she left me. The month passed slowly, allowing ample time for Christmas shopping. I made sure to buy gifts for everyone. Additionally, I packed belongings for my new job and rented a car for the cross-country drive. I also conversed with a helpful woman at my new office, who informed me she had selected a few well-appointed, furnished apartments near the office. The pleasant surprise was she would personally show them to me upon my arrival in Spokane. Yes, everything was falling into place for me. Arriving at Joan and Frank's on Christmas Day, I discovered Katie and her partner had already arrived. Joan warmly embraced me, commenting on the surprise before returning to dinner preparations. I smiled inwardly, thinking, if only she knew what a true surprise this was. Frank greeted me, taking my coat, as I quickly inquired, "Can I see my grandson?" Frank nodded, mentioning the baby was asleep in the nursery, but I could visit quietly. I entered and observed the sleeping figure before me, a surge of emotion washing over me, aware that soon I would depart, unable to stay. Sensing movement behind me, Katie silently approached and stood beside me. I couldn't help but feel the irony that she should have been here since June. Katie whispered, "We have a wonderful grandson, Tom." Filled with sadness, I replied, "Yes, Katie, but who will he call Grandpa? Me or the fool, or both?" Katie seemed taken aback. "Why would you say that? You're the only grandfather this child will ever have, Tom," I murmured quietly. "Let's hope you're right, Katie." And then I left the room. The following hours were filled with conversation between Frank and me, while Joan, Katie, and Greg seemed lost in their own world. I was disappointed at how quickly my daughter fell for Greg's charms. Frank seemed equally unhappy, but I reassured him, promising changes that night. His eyes gleamed as he whispered, "I hope so, Dad. I can't stand that fool around her anymore. At this rate, he'll soon be cozying up to Joan." Dinner was served, and although the food was delicious, the company was lacking. Once again, I felt no desire to converse with my wife or her partner, and Frank seemed hesitant to speak up as well. The only one who spoke was Greg, regaling the women with tales of his bravery. Watching Greg with his small fan club made me feel sick. After dinner, Joan brought the baby into the living room, and we all gathered together. Observing my family, I realized this might be the last time we shared such a moment. Joan seemed happy as she eagerly instructed Frank to distribute gifts. When he did, Joan gave her mom, Greg, and me presents. Katie received a sweater, Greg a gift card, and I received a tie. Practical yet uninspired gifts, much like how my wife and daughter perceived me. When Frank, Joan, and the baby unwrapped their presents from Katie and Greg, Joan smiled and laughed, while Frank remained polite but distant. Once everyone finished opening their gifts, the room fell silent as all eyes turned to me and my bag of presents. Breaking the silence, I declared, "To conclude this wonderful evening, I want to give you all the gifts you deserve this holiday season." Standing up, I retrieved the bag I had brought and handed Frank and Joan a large envelope wrapped in festive paper. Joan eagerly tore open the wrapping, while Frank watched as Joan sifted through the papers inside the envelope. Her joyous scream filled the room when she realized its contents. Katie shifted in her seat, eager to learn what the papers held. Wasting no time, Joan shared the news with her, exclaiming, "Mom, Dad gave us the house for free, no mortgage. Now we can move out of this rental. Isn't that amazing?" Katie's expression faltered as she looked at me with concern. "Why did you do this, Tom? Where will we live?" I shot her a piercing look, hoping to convey my feelings. Don't worry, Katie. I've thought of everything. Here, this is for you. Handing her a card in a wrapped box, I watched as she tore open the paper, revealing a bracelet inside. Surprise painted her face as she pulled it out, prompting me to say, "Take a look at the inscription." I wrote it. Observing Greg's displeasure at her gift, Katie turned the bracelet over, revealing the words, "Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Tom." I glanced at Greg, noting his frown, while Katie appeared puzzled. "Tom, thank you, dear. This is lovely, but you forgot to write 'with love.'" I offered a smile. "I didn't forget, Katie. I simply chose not to lie. My love for you has been fading steadily in recent months. This bracelet is my farewell and a reminder of what you sacrificed for your partner. Also, you'll receive divorce papers on Monday." I heard Joan inhale sharply while Katie's face twisted with disbelief and despair. Nodding towards the postcard in the card, I continued, "I attempted to express gratitude for the wonderful years in our daughter. There's also a check for half our liquid assets, though it's not much, $195, spent during your absence. The house was intended for my daughter when you left our marriage, as explained further in the card." Turning to Greg, I anticipated the brewing storm. "This gift is for you as well." Handing Katie another large envelope, she looked stunned. "Inside is the full account of what your lover has been up to since your high school days. I believe you'll find it an interesting read." Before I could finish, Greg erupted, threatening, "I'll ruin you, you son of a—" Greg collapsed to the floor with a thud as my stun gun made contact, ensuring he remained incapacitated. Joan and Katie stood up, and I administered another 2 shocks to Greg's groin area just to ensure he stayed down. Moving closer to him, I remarked, "Feeling the pain? Well, let me tell you, your agony is nothing compared to losing the woman I cherished for 30 years to scum like you." Katie sobbed as if the world was ending when I turned to her. "I know I'm not as exciting as your sergeant, but I won't forget what you did," I said, administering another shock for good measure, relishing in his convulsions. "This never gets old." I glanced back at Katie, summoning more bravado than my shattered heart allowed. "Anyway, since you seem to enjoy this affair, I'm giving you the ultimate gift, Katie, freedom. Now you can live your life being pampered by day and entertained by night. Perfect for a traitor like you, isn't it?" Katie struggled to speak to say something, but her words were choked by the sobs that racked her body. "Tom, please. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I was going to come back to you in June. I love you," she stammered, her voice trembling with desperation. The reality of what she had lost seemed to finally hit her as she stood Tom, but I had nothing left to give her, no sympathy, no understanding, and certainly no forgiveness. I turned away from her, my emotions hardened by the months of betrayal and heartache. "It's too late, Katie," I said, my voice cold and distant. "You've made your choices, and now you'll have to live with them. There's nothing left between—" Joan, who had been watching the entire scene with wide, disbelieving eyes, finally broke down. "Dad, please don't do this. There's still time to fix things," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me with a mix of fear and hope, desperately wanting to believe that her family could be well, but I knew better. The damage was done, and no amount of wishing or pleading could undo the pain that had been inflicted. "I'm sorry, Joan," I said, softening my tone as I looked at my daughter. "But this is the only way forward for me. I can't stay in a marriage that's been so thoroughly destroyed." She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I don't like it, but I understand," she whispered, wiping her tears. "I just wish things could have been different." As I continued driving through the falling snow, the memories of the past few months played like a haunting reel in my mind, a reminder of all that had been lost. But with each mile, the weight on my chest began to lighten. Spokane was still hours away, but it represented something I hadn't felt in a long time, a chance to start anew. The highway was quiet, almost deserted as I pressed on, the rhythmic hum of the engine the only sound accompanying my thoughts. I began to plan for my new life, thinking of the apartment I would soon call home, the new job that awaited me, and the freedom I would finally reclaim. But there was also something else, an urge to confront the ghosts that had been tormenting me. The private investigator's report on Greg was still fresh in my mind, filled with details that painted a much darker picture of the man who had stolen my wife. It wasn't just his history of infidelity or his shady financial dealings. There was something deeper, something that gnawed at me, urging me to dig further. With my decision made, I picked up my phone and called the investigator. "I need you to look into one more thing," I said after he answered. "Find out everything you can about Greg's connections, any ties he has to people in high places, any debts, any old enemies. I want to know who this man really is." The investigator agreed, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that whatever Greg was hiding would soon be brought to light. I wasn't looking for revenge, at least that's what I told myself, but I wanted closure, a sense of justice for everything I had been through. As I put the phone down, the snowstorm intensified, making visibility difficult. I slowed down, carefully navigating the icy roads, my mind still racing with thoughts of what I might uncover. The idea of exposing Greg for who he truly was gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to keep pushing forward. Hours passed, and as dawn began to break, I finally crossed into Washington. The snow had lessened, and the first hints of sunlight peeked through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the landscape. The city of Spokane appeared on the horizon, its skyline a mix of old and new, much like the life I was about to embark on. I checked into a modest hotel just outside the city, deciding to rest before taking the next steps. As I lay on the bed, exhaustion finally caught up with me, and I drifted into a deep sleep, the tension of the last few months momentarily forgotten. When I awoke, it was late afternoon, and the snow had stopped. I felt strangely calm, as if the time spent sleeping had washed away some of the pain. I knew I couldn't avoid the final confrontation forever, but for now, I wanted to focus on the future. I met with my new boss the next day, and the meeting went better than I had expected. He was understanding of my situation and eager to have me on board. The office was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I had left behind. That evening, I visited the apartments that had been recommended to me. They were clean, comfortable, and most importantly, a blank slate, no memories, no ghosts of the past. I chose one with a view of the river, where the water's steady flow reminded me that life, no matter how turbulent, always moved forward. As I settled into my new home, I received a call from the investigator. "Tom, I found something," he said, his tone serious. "Greg isn't just a cheater. He's been involved in some very dangerous dealings, shady business transactions, connections with known criminals. He's in deep with some bad people, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's in debt to them." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just about Greg and Katie anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that could put them both in danger. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The investigator hesitated before replying. "I think you need to warn Katie. She might not listen to you, but she needs to know what she's involved with." I hung up, my mind racing. Katie had made her choices, but if there was a chance she was in danger, I couldn't ignore it. I knew that calling her would be opening old wounds, but I had to do it. I had to try and save her from whatever darkness Greg had dragged her into. With trembling hands, I dialed her number. It rang several times before she answered, her voice cautious. "Tom? Katie, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't about us or what happened. It's about Greg. He's involved with some very dangerous people, and I don't think you understand how serious this is." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her processing the information, weighing it against her own experiences and feelings. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaky. "What do you mean? What are you saying, Tom?" "I'm saying that Greg's in deep trouble, and if you're with him, so are you. I'm not trying to scare you, Katie, but you need to be careful. These aren't just some old flames rekindling an affair. These are people who won't hesitate to hurt you if it suits their needs." The silence that followed was deafening. I could tell she was struggling to reconcile her emotions with the facts I was presenting. "I don't know if I can believe you," she finally said, her voice small. "I'm not asking you to believe me, Katie. I'm asking you to be safe. Just be careful. And if you ever need help, you know where to find me," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. She didn't respond, but I could hear her breathing, heavy and uncertain. "Take care of yourself, Katie. I said softly before hanging up the phone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, wondering if I had done the right thing. The line between caring and letting go was blurred, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that something was still waiting in the shadows, ready to emerge. But I couldn't dwell on it. I had a new life to build, and that required all of my focus and energy. As I looked out at the river from my apartment window, I made a silent vow. No matter what happened, I would move forward. I would find peace in this new chapter of my life, even if it meant leaving behind everything I once knew. The days turned into weeks, and slowly I began to find a rhythm in my new life. I threw myself into work, making new connections and building a reputation in Spokane. The city was kind to me, offering a sense of community that I hadn't realized I was missing. I even started seeing someone, a woman named Emily, who worked at the local bookstore. She was kind, intelligent, and had a warmth about her that drew me in. It was nothing serious at first, just a few dinners and long conversations, but it was enough to remind me that life could be good again, that I could feel something other than pain and betrayal. But the shadow of Greg's involvement still loomed over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I kept my phone close, half expecting a call from Katie, telling me that she needed help, that she had finally realized the truth. That call never came. Instead, it was the investigator who called me one late afternoon, his voice tense and urgent. "Tom, we need to talk. I've uncovered something more, and it's not good." My heart sank as I listened to him outline the latest findings. Greg had crossed a line with the wrong people, and now they were looking for him. They knew about Katie, knew where she lived, and it was only a matter of time before they came after her too. "I don't know what you can do, Tom," the investigator said, his voice heavy, "but if you still care about her, you need to get her out of there." I hung up, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. I had thought I was done with this, that I could move on and leave it all behind. But the past had a way of catching up, and now it seemed that both Katie's life and mine were on the line. I stood up, the decision made before I even realized it. I couldn't leave her to face this alone, not after everything we had been through. She might have betrayed me, but I couldn't let her pay with her life. I grabbed my coat and keys, ready to drive back, to face whatever awaited me there. The snow had started falling again, but this time, it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like a reckoning. As I headed out the door, Emily appeared in the hallway, concern etched on her face. "Tom, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine worry. I paused, torn between the life I was trying to build and the one I was about to confront. "I don't know," I admitted, meeting her eyes. "But I have to go. There's something I need to take care of." She nodded, understanding in her gaze. "Be careful," she said, squeezing my hand, "and come back in one piece, okay?" I managed a small smile, grateful for her concern. "I'll do my best," I promised, before heading out into the snow, the cold biting at my skin as I prepared to face whatever awaited me back home. The drive felt endless, the roads slick with ice and snow, but I kept going, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I didn't know what I would find when I got there, but I knew I couldn't turn back. As I approached the city where I had once lived, the memories flooded back, the life I had, the betrayal, the hurt, but I pushed it all aside, focusing on the task at hand. When I finally reached Katie's neighborhood, my heart pounded in my chest. The house was dark, no signs of life inside, but I knew better than to assume it was empty. I parked a few blocks away, my breath visible in the frigid air as I cautiously approached the house. My instincts were on high alert, every shadow, every sound making me jump. I reached the front door, hesitating for only a moment before trying the handle. It was locked, as expected. I moved around to the back, finding the door there unlocked, slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. The house was eerily quiet, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I moved through the rooms, my heart racing as I searched for any sign of Katie. The house was a mess, furniture overturned, drawers pulled out. It was clear someone had been here before me, and they hadn't left quietly. Finally, I reached the living room, where I found Katie sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, eyes wide with fear. Her face was bruised, her clothes disheveled. She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came." I knelt beside her, my heart breaking at the sight of her so broken and afraid. "I'm here, Katie," I said softly. "We need to get you out of here. Now." She nodded, too scared to argue, as I helped her to her feet. But before we could take a step, a voice from the shadows stopped us cold. "Going somewhere?" I turned, my blood running cold as Greg stepped out of the darkness, a gun in his hand, a twisted smile on his face. "You just couldn't stay away, could you, Tom?" Katie gasped, clutching my arm as I tried to shield her from him. "Greg, put the gun down. You don't have to do this." But he just laughed, the sound chilling in the stillness of the room. "Oh, I think I do," he said, his eyes wild with anger. "You took everything from me, Tom. My life, my wife, and now you think you can just waltz in here and take her back? No, this ends here." The next moments were a blur. Katie's scream, the sound of a gunshot, the searing pain in my shoulder as I fell to the ground. I heard the scuffle as Katie fought with Greg, her desperate cries filling the room. I struggled to stay conscious, the pain overwhelming, but I forced myself to move, to help her. With what strength I had left, I tackled Greg, the gun clattering to the floor as we both hit the ground. Katie grabbed the gun, her hands shaking as she aimed it at Greg. "Get out, Greg, now," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Greg hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. But he must have seen the determination in Katie's eyes, because he slowly backed away, raising his hands in surrender. "Fine," he sneered, "but this isn't over, I'll be back." Katie kept the gun trained on him until he disappeared out the door. Then she collapsed beside me, her hands trembling as she reached for me. "Tom, oh my God, Tom, you're bleeding." I nodded weakly, the pain in my shoulder nearly unbearable. "We need to get out of here," I muttered through gritted teeth. Katie helped me to my feet, and together we stumbled out of the house, away from the nightmare that had consumed our lives. As we reached the street, I heard sirens in the distance. Someone must have called the police. By the time they arrived, Greg was long gone, but we were safe, for now. I was taken to the hospital, where the doctors patched me up. The bullet had passed clean through my shoulder, missing anything vital, but the recovery would be long and painful. Katie stayed by my side the entire time, her eyes filled with regret and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Tom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted this to happen. I thought I could handle it, but I was so wrong." I looked at her, my own emotions a tangle of anger, sorrow, and something else. Something that I couldn't quite name. "We both made mistakes, Katie," I said softly, "but now we have to deal with the consequences." She nodded, squeezing my hand. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it right," she promised. "Even if it means letting you go." As the days passed and I began to heal, Katie kept her distance, respecting my need for space. But she also made it clear that she was ready to face whatever came next, even if that meant facing it alone. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing. We had both been through hell, and somehow we had come out the other side. The road to forgiveness, if it ever came, would be long and difficult. But for now, I was content to take things one day at a time, focusing on my recovery and on rebuilding my life. Katie returned to Spokane with me after I was released from the hospital. She moved into a small apartment nearby, and we began to navigate the new, fragile relationship we were trying to build, one based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the lies and betrayals of the past. And as winter turned to spring, I found myself hopeful for the first time in a long time. The scars from the past would always be there, but they didn't have to define the future. We had both been broken, but we were still here, still standing, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.